What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the podcast. We are live from the Hot Chick in Scottsdale, Arizona. This is episode 704 of the podcast. Remember, we are presented by OSNAP Active Lifestyle. Head on over to osnap.com/Jack O'Hara to get your product today. Tyler, you have your full list of conspiracy theories here with us. Let's tell the story first of how you got here today.
Well,
okay. You pulled up in a minivan. Wasn't your car. Your car broke down. What happened?
Basically, you try to get in my truck, started like do every day, you know what I mean? And then just, my lights kind of went crazy, and then it just shut off. Could have been alternator, battery, whatever. You know, the conspiracy's out to get me to not come on the show and, talk about what we're going to talk about. But I'm here.
Where's the car? Is it
still? Still in the garage, you know. So luckily it didn't break down in the middle of traffic.
It's still in the middle of the highway.
Yeah, where it's nice and hot out, you just sit there roasting, you're like, oh shit. So I would have been a little bit more late if that was the case. Luckily, it just, right before I was about to gum, it died out, so, yeah.
And the background on you work here at the Hot Chick, correct?
AGM here.
AGM. A general manager. High authority.
So to speak. Mostly running the bars, still doing all the bar manager duties, but AGM here, so pretty much.
Still doing the grit work.
The grit work, the office work, the ordering, the drinks, the cocktails, things like that. The importance, a lot of the importance.
That's right, the things that make everything work, right?
We're making it tick here.
That's right, the thing that makes the wheel run.
Right.
A spoke on the wheel, per se. But an important spoke nonetheless. Because if you want it done right, you got to do it yourself.
Yeah, that's what we got. Great management team here. Got a great staff here. Good vibes, you know what I mean? Obviously, the podcast is doing well here, so
far.
Exuding, you know what I mean? So everything's going well.
Yeah, baby steps. But you're the guy that everybody says he just loves conspiracy theories. And by the end of the night, we're all like, he's right. It's true.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things that start out as conspiracy theories, like we've even seen the last couple of years, they turn out to have some truth behind them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? When we talk about, what just happened recently with the pandemic, a lot of things that we weren't allowed to talk about ended up having some truth behind them. You know what I mean? And
naturally.
Right on putting on that hat, you know what I mean? It's just not to get politically polarizing or things like that, too. I like to tackle a lot of the fun conspiracies. A lot of the conspiracies, you could kind of go down a rabbit hole, and they could kind of almost make you depressed, when you talk about the control the government has and things like that. Those are the ones that could kind of put a damper on your day. I like
drained.
Yeah, and it's just you almost feel just futile, your efforts, or what can you do to actually overcome and just do something that would be better for yourself and betterment of the people around you. But actually when you start talking about aliens, UFOs, Bigfoots, the moon, the pyramids of Giza, those are kind of the fun conspiracy I like to research, because a lot of that entails of what are the secrets of humanity, what are the actual the occulted history of what we have as humans, and what are the actual potentials that we have as humans. You know what I mean? I think those are probably my favorite and most interesting conspiracies. So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited to get into some of these.
Okay.
I wasn't huge on conspiracy theories when COVID happened. Obviously, you start hearing things and rumblings left and right about what happened, what could have happened, what they're not telling you what happened, and everybody kind of comes together and kind of shoots their own narrative with it. I was reading a book. I'm a huge rock and roll guy.
Yeah.
And Kurt Cobain's death from Nirvana.
Oh, yeah.
There's a huge conspiracy out that his wife, Courtney Love, conspired to kill him, as opposed to him committing suicide.
I remember that.
And I read multiple books about it. And I was convinced by the end of it. I'm like, she did it.
Right.
There's no other way. Why doesn't anybody know this? Why doesn't anybody talk about it? It's because it happened 30 years ago. Nobody really gives a shit.
It's 30 years ago, and it's, it's one of those things where it's whatever we do now is not going to bring them back. At the very least, and I kind of studied that one a little bit too, it's just she didn't give a shit about him, you know what I mean?
When he died, it was just I'm getting my residuals, it's whatever.
Yeah, it was just, she didn't seem to give a flying fuck of whether Kurt was, around or anything like that, you know what I mean? There was no emotional attachment there. Yeah, that's a big one too, and I was a big Nirvana fan, still am too, you know what I mean? So.
And it's you can't really bring it up in interviews with Dave or any of them, because it's who cares?
Yeah, I mean, it's just you want to talk about something that's positive too. You know what I mean? It's just oh, Kurt Cobain, he's not here with us anymore. Immortalized ever in his music, you know what I mean? So, but is that your favorite conspiracy theory?
That's one of them, probably. Just because after reading multiple books about it, I'm that kind of adds up.
Right,
that's the thing about conspiracy theories, is that they make sense.
Yeah, a lot of times they do. And a lot of times if you look at the root of conspiracy theory, what is it really a conspiracy theory? It's people conspiring. People conspire all the time. They really do. behind closed doors. People have plans for people in jobs to move up. People have plans for people to be in certain situations. It's essentially conspiring. So a lot of times people will conspire, it's for their own benefit.
That's right.
So if people are conspiring for their own benefit, like we saw with, you know, money being made, a lot of times this is a reflection on greed, it's a reflection on power, it's a reflection on pretty much what the world you kind of see today. And those are the conspiracies where you kind of look at and you're like, all right, the simplest explanation is probably true. These people are fucking people over and getting greedy. So, you know, and those are the ones that, you know, those are the ones that kind of make me a little bit depressed. It's just because, like, lack of faith in humanity and things like that, you kind of see. But
what are some of the more depressing ones that make you very upset? The one during COVID was the Tom Hanks and Oprah Winfrey drinking like baby blood to stay young.
Oh,
that's like absurd.
See, that's the adrenochrome, I think you're talking about.
Yes, exactly, right? But
See,
like,
that,
it was so absurd, but at the same time, when you're looking at all the information, you're like, could this be true?
That one's a dark one too, and that kind of wraps into this whole like elite cabal and like a lot of these music entertainment too. A lot of them are connected with, and not all these people too. I know plenty of like, you know, Freemasons, but a lot of these are like into a club, an elitist club, where you kind of see this with the Jeffrey Epstein thing too. You know what I mean? It's just like, okay, the two security guards who fall asleep, both cameras not working. This guy has pretty much a private island where it's known that it's called Lolita Express, where, you know, it's kind of underage girls and all these people where they're supposedly blackmailed into this kind of like elitist club. But yeah, the adrenochrome kind of takes them to that like really weird, really dark kind of like level too. A lot of times when people are even talking about that on the internet, you get completely blacklisted. There's actually an internet researcher called Mouthy Buddha, and he was just a regular UFO researcher. I remember watching him back in the day, and he had a lot of good videos explaining really good in depth about, you know, UFO phenomenon, you know, certain things that would happen. And then he kind of got into this like dark web, dark what's going on. A lot of symbology that you see that's reflected in Disney, Nickelodeon. There's spy wrangles, these certain things that you see, and it's just like, a lot of these are known as like, you know, pedophilia symbols and things like that. And then you talk about like, you know, the drinking of baby blood and like, you know, and they actually have some of this too. They talk about the blood banks, and like they call them blood boys and stuff like that, where, you know, some people, they have these like, they get blood transfusions often from these in shape 18-year-olds. They're supposed to, and they have to fill out these applications where they don't smoke, they eat healthy, and they feel completely revitalized, almost the same way like a vampire would to stay alive. And it's just, it's really creepy and it's really dark. How deep that rabbit hole goes, that's one where it's like, the symbology is the evidence, you know what I mean? And if you actually see a lot of that, Valencia was another one with Adidas.
That's right.
You see a lot of that weird symbology kind of go on, and you're like, okay, why would this be here? What reason would a spy ring will be in the small world, It's a Small World ride? On the teacups, you'd see some of these symbologies. On the Jungle Book CD, on Flight of the Intruder, you'd see a lot of this stuff. And there's visual evidence where you could go back and corroborate this stuff.
Oh, like, are people truly that evil?
Yeah,
you know?
and it's just really, and are they really even, and that goes down a whole different rabbit hole, are they even really 100% people? Like, you know what I mean? What are we being run by? And this goes into, it's funny how all the conspiracies really kind of connect.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It gets really deep. You start talking about like human history and what's really going on and what happened in the US in the last 100 years. My favorite one that I kind of go back to, I mean, I have a couple favorite, but the one that I could actually, you could kind of gauge and you could kind of look at seriously is the JFK assassination. Recently they had like, you know, they were trying to dig up, you know, another Warren Commission and see exactly what was happening with him. But most recently the CIA said, oh yeah, we're not going to release this. It goes by the wayside again. None of the mainstream media really picks it up. You know what I mean? They talk about like, you know, the magic bullet. It's been exposed again and again. But here's what really happened with JFK. So he's in Dallas, basically got shot by a lone gunman who got killed by another lone gunman. Before that lone gunman can ever talk, that lone gunman was put in a solitary confinement cell, only talked to by another CIA operative who only visited him and considered him completely insane. That was it. There was really no other questioning behind that. So it's just like, oh yeah, lone gunman killed him, no questions asked. Fuck exposing Operation Northwoods, which was a complete thing of like, you know, how it was a fabricated injustice to actually put the attack on the American people. That was something that was uncovered by JFK. He made a lot of enemies while he was in office, but just looking at it logically, okay, our sitting president of the United States, this is the last assassination that ever happened, was killed by somebody who had extreme ties to the CIA. The boss of Lee Harvey Oswald was actually a CIA operative who worked with MK Ultra, and that is an operative where they ran experiments on Johns and people with acid, and they actually tried mind control with certain people. So that was actually his boss who was working with Lee Harvey Oswald. All connections in the small city of New Orleans where everyone knew each other. Jack Ruby was also the person who killed Lee Harvey Oswald. He was the one who pretty much took out, he was the one who took out Lee Harvey Oswald. And then, it was just like, just looking at that logically and how there was in the Warren Commission, pretty much everything fell by the wayside. That was pretty much the commission that was set up by the CIA. And Alan Dulles at the time, who actually had deep connections, he was the head of the CIA, pretty much kind of washed everything under the rug.
Yeah.
And it's funny because no one really, questioned after that. I mean, as the American people, you trust the media and you trust what you're being told. A lot of times, at least certainly back then.
Do you think in like this day and age there'd be way more eyebrows raised?
I think so. I think people have a healthy mistrust of power in the government now rather than what they did before. And I think that's a good thing because I think the government has been compromised.
Yeah.
I think the government, what it was built on with good intentions with the Constitution as a constitutional republic, is very much compromised now. I don't even know how much our leaders are actually really even elected or if they're actually engineered to be the political figures that they are and actually causing diversion and tactics where to be so polarizing. You know what I mean? It almost seems like there's such extremes going on that it seems like it's almost engineered. It just smells fishy, a lot of this stuff that you see. There's not a really good cohesive nature to the news. Have you ever seen those like news breaks where it's like, and they all start talking in the same exact pitch, and it's all local news stations, and they have the same exact script they're reading off. And it zooms out, and it's pretty much you see one person talking about like, oh, tonight on the news, this horrible tragedy, and they all say the same thing, and it shows the equivalent of like you zoom out, it's 1,000 different news stations reading off the same script.
That's right.
And it's the major media is controlled by 5 different companies, you know what I mean? And they're all conglomerate of pretty much what's overseas. Like if you actually want real news without an opinionated bias, you almost really have to go to the internet. You know what I mean? You almost really have to go to a different source. And even then it gets very hairy. So, but the JFK thing is like one of those things. I think he was maybe the last sitting president that we had was really trying to uncover the truth. He actually had one of these famous speeches 5 days before he died, where he's talking about secret organizations, secret societies, and how bad it is to keep things rather than open within trust and actually being covered up with, just this blanket of mistrust, And it's just, it's unfortunate.
Yeah, we can't have any of that. No truth.
Yeah,
no truth at the helm. We gotta eliminate that quick.
The truth.
He's breaking the fourth wall.
Yeah, he's breaking the fourth wall. And a lot of this kind of comes to light too. You talk about like Operation Mockingbird. Operation Mockingbird took place in the 1950s where the CIA actually openly, this got uncovered by Freedom of Information Act. And I think the 1970s they uncovered it. Supposedly it doesn't go on anymore, but it was actually a CIA program where they infiltrated magazines, TV shows, movies, and things like that to actually garner support for certain wars, to garner support for pretty much everything that they wanted to do. Like it was essentially to trick, kind of what the CIA does today in other countries and even here, whatever they want to do, like manipulate public opinion in order to get what they want. And a lot of this goes back to the military-industrial complex. It's what Dwight Eisenhower made his famous speech, his exit speech about. JFK made his famous speech about warning us about the immense power of like how much war and how much racketeering it really actually affects like our day-to-day lives. And really it's the biggest money-making scheme in the entire world. You know what I mean? The amount of money that's generated from war, I guess you could even say the jobs it produces, but it's really, people get rich off war. Dick Cheney was proof of that with Halliburton too. You know what I mean? It's like a lot of times getting U.S. into wars, and we haven't won a war since World War II. A lot of these wars are just manufactured. We take out leaders and things like that. We pretty much go into certain places like in the Middle East and we build up, this certain leader and then we take them out, you know what I mean? It's all like a divide and conquer. So we could keep spending money for the military-industrial complex. I think that's really, when you get at the root of things, what's really causing like the uproar for everything that we see.
We'll talk about a negative conspiracy theory, 9/11.
Yeah.
People say Bush was behind it and Cheney and...
What do you think?
No.
No?
I don't think Bush had the intelligence enough to do something like that. Cheney maybe.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like you saw that movie, right?
Loose Change? Or which
Vice
one was
with Christian Bale.
I don't think I saw that one. No.
So he plays Dick Cheney in a movie called Vice.
I heard he did really good in that. I never watched that, though.
I mean, he does great in every movie.
True.
I rewatched The Dark Knight last night with a few friends. Top 3 movies I think I've ever seen in my life.
It's great.
With Christian
Yeah,
Bale,
Dark
right?
Knight, as far as
you don't even have to be a fan of DC or anything like that
True.
to watch that movie. It's incredible. But yeah, he played Dick Cheney in a movie called Vice about basically what Dick Cheney did. Basically, he was a running president, doing all of the dirty work behind the scenes for George Bush.
Yeah.
But no, I think that's way too far-fetched. But there are people that believe that, and then there's people who believe that the Sandy Hook shooting, school shooting back in I believe it was 2011, 2012.
Yeah.
December of 2012. People believe that never even took place. Like Sandy Hook was a school that was not even in.
Yeah, I heard about
not
that
even
one. Yeah.
In whatchamacallit.
Not even a school in
It
that
wasn't even a
particular
school,
area,
yeah.
And I know Alex Jones was a big proponent of that. He ended up getting sued, and he's obviously one of the godfathers of conspiracy too. And he got completely taken apart by that conspiracy because he was one of the big proponents of saying that one was a hoax and things like that. And whenever you're talking about kids being shot, and if there's real families being affected like that, and you start just going on and parading people, and almost his followers were pretty much harassing the parents of the dead children too. You're gonna have some bad backlash. You better come in and making sure that is without doubt substantial proof that you have that this was a hoax. That was a rough one for him too, and I think there are operations like that where, it's a little bit fishy. I think when you talk about mass shootings and things like that, certainly the one with the bump stocks and you talk about like what that guy did basically in Las Vegas and Mandalay Bay, the amount of ammunition that he flew out to. Talking to some of my buddies one of my buddies is he's a head of sniper unit in the Army. And he talks about how the impossibility of what they actually described that he did with all those bumps, just shooting random people. It seemed like it was actually more of a team of people. The pictures, everything like that, seemed a little fishy. And the random act of violence too. You know what I mean? When you talk about Sandy Hook, is there a motive? Yeah, there was. His mom, he was a little psycho kid. He was spending a lot of time with the kids too. Just a complete nutcase, you know what I mean? Random acts of violence by pretty much a whale. This guy had a ton of money and was just, capping people. I'm not saying it can't happen, but I'm saying if you look at what motives there are too, you know what I mean? This guy was independently wealthy, had a ton of ammunition, things like that, guns, but that one always struck me as a little fishy. But I want to get back to 9/11, talking about that. I kind of went back and forth on that one for a little bit too, because actually I did subscribe to the pancake theory, but you start looking at some more things that would happen. And the things that, you could just look at logically and you'd be like, well, how does this happen, You talk about Muhammad Atta, one of the guys who flew into the, Twin Towers. And they found his passport in mint condition. They didn't find black boxes, they didn't find anything else, but they found this guy's passport. And they're like, okay, well, how does that even happen? You know what I mean? And the wreckage and everything like that, and the pancake theory behind all that. Another thing that I always kind of found interesting was like Building 7. You know what I mean? It just didn't look like it had the structural damage to completely collapse. And if you look at the way it collapsed, it actually collapses in the way a controlled demolition would work. You talk about Larry Silverstein pulling out that big insurance settlement right before, a big insurance policy, 3 days right before 9/11 happened, restructuring this whole insurance thing. Like, it seems like, at the very least, if they're not in on it, they allowed it to happen to get us into a war again that we weren't supposed to be in. There was no weapons of mass destruction. We didn't even really go after, straight after Afghanistan, like right away. It was like, okay, we're going to Iraq. Like, everyone's pissed, everyone's up in arms. Let's take all this support that we have, this thirst for blood. Let's go into Iraq. Oh, we have found weapons of mass destruction. That's another conspiracy that ended up, never really happening. They never found weapons of mass destruction. It was all something. We just wanted to displace another dictator and kind of just literally leave it as is. It was another thing for the military-industrial complex. And I think actually to a lot of your points, you're right. I think a lot of that is engineered by Dick Cheney and Halliburton, and a lot of connections he has with the military-industrial complex. So,
1,000%. I think there was something. It was definitely there was something, right? I'll just say that there was something going.
Something fishy about it. You know what I mean? So there was. I don't know if it's orchestrated like necessarily against like, how much of it was real, how much of it was allowed to happen, but I definitely don't buy the whole story. You know what I mean? A lot of times stories are shifted. If something bad happens, I know a lot of times since the American media is pretty much controlled under one conglomerate, let's make some money off this. Oh, a tragedy happened, we're gonna make some money. Not gonna make money off ratings, you're gonna make money off the entire a collaboration of what's going to happen. You're going to make money off the war. People are going to be watching for the war. People are going to be making money. You're who you get told from your executives. We're going to be making money off the military-industrial complex. Of all the money, we're going to be doing this. Basically, the blood of Americans and the blood of innocent citizens. You know what I mean? Other militaries too. Like pretty much, that's where I believe that a lot of these conspiracies kind of boil down to. Like if you're going to make, people will fuck other people over for money. I think you've been alive long enough where someone's owed you money and they never paid you back.
That's
you know what I mean? And I think that's really on a grand scale, that's where it happens again too. So
what's the least convincing conspiracy theory that caught a lot of wind in your estimation?
Chemtrails, you know what I mean? I think it's a tough one for me to buy. It's one of those ones where it's like it's been out there forever, and I know people who swear by it and they're like, yeah, they're poisoning us and things like that. I try to again look at the least, you know, or the simplest explanation, or the simplest like rule of like what human logic would do. So these people that would be apparently like, you know, going over cities where they live and their families live, and they'd be dropping these toxic chemicals on, they would just be fine with this. These are pilots. These aren't, unless they're not human by some standards, they'd be just dropping these things that would pretty much be making us all dumber, making us all more toxic, causing us more obesity, diabetes, whatever the case, whatever that conspiracy is. That one just never made sense to me. Do they try to seed the weather? Do they try to seed clouds? Absolutely, that's a proven thing. And do you see a lot of these, you know, things up in the air? Yeah, those are contrails. Those are things that when jets are so high up in the atmosphere, they leave ice clouds behind them. Those are contrails from that. So I've never really bought the chemtrail things over big cities to control the population to make them dumber. That one was always just silly to me because it just never made sense.
And people are just fishing for things.
Yeah, they're fishing for things.
Things.
I think a lot of times too, I think a lot of this stuff, when you look at the UFO conspiracy, and that's a big one too, that's one that's been around forever. A lot of times, you know, they're gonna muck up the waters. And they actually even have people from the CIA, United States Air Force, Department of Naval Intelligence, they will muck up the waters to make whatever that is credible seem uncredible or discredited. I think the word would be. But yeah, that goes all the way back to Roswell. You know what I mean? That whole thing. Literally there was truth behind it, and they mucked up the water so bad with that, now no one knew what to believe. But you could look at the facts right through that one, and that's real. You know what I mean? That one's 100% real, and that I believe in too. I mean, there's enough sworn affidavits, there's enough evidence. I mean, you could find the guy from the 509th Bomb Squadron, Jesse Marcel, the guy who worked on the atomic bomb squadron, the guy who's more qualified than anyone walking around planet Earth, one of them at least, finding the wreckage from Roswell and describing what he saw, and then saying that he was forced to pose with wreckage that was not from Roswell. And you got Lieutenant Walter Hott, I'm sorry. He was actually the one who actually, his sworn affidavit came out in 2007 saying that they did actually find alien bodies. He was actually witness to it, and they did find, you know, this strange metamaterial. They describe it, a lot of this is described the same thing too. They talk about this, it's essentially like, you ever see that foil that's on a cigarette pack? They talk about it actually trying to bend it, trying to hit it with a sledgehammer, trying to rip it. It would always bounce back into the same, super light, but this metamaterial was just unlike anything they've ever seen. A lot of it had hieroglyphics on it. He was taken to a hangar where you saw this about 13 to 17 foot egg-shaped UFO. Same thing that Lonnie Zamora found in Socorro, New Mexico. A lot of these things collaborate with other evidence of what's been going on, the well-documented UFO cases. But a lot of those get thrown to the side because there's so much bullshit out there. You know what I mean? But
it just gets mixed into with it, and people are just like, nah, it's all BS.
And that's really how you that's how you destroy credibility. You know what I mean? When you set something up to be found as discredited, you know what I mean? Okay, that guy's full of shit. Why would I believe anything that they have to say? Do you know who Bob Lazar is?
No.
Okay, so Bob Lazar, he's gained a lot of heat recently from being on the Joe Rogan podcast. He's this wizard of a scientist who worked apparently on S4 and Area 51 during the 1980s. He was discovered by George Knapp, who's a Las Vegas news reporter. He would want to come out in secrecy. His whole story seemed like crazy at first. He would describe UFOs as moving around with this new technology that was never quite explained to the public. People have always seen UFOs, but he actually was one that was supposedly reverse engineering these things. S4 is a base, I think, about 30 miles north of Area 51 in Groom Lake. It's hangars that are built into the side of the mountains in Las Vegas, Nevada. his credibility lies a lot in what he talks about, and he's been vindicated for what actually went on the base. So what he originally was discredited by was like his academic credentials. And good researchers have tried pointing him out and just saying like, okay, you never went to school at MIT, or you never went to school and accomplished these things. Other professionals, there'd be a paper trail for that. So apparently on like what he worked on and everything that he had going for him, it was such a secret project, he pretty much had to have his whole history wiped from everything like that. Yeah. But if you listen to him talking about this in the 80s, and he talks about gravitational propulsion and things like that, it's essentially creating a distortion. So if you look at science and physics, gravity distorts space and time. So a lot of these things they don't necessarily move through space and time, they actually bring space closer to them because the amplification of gravity. The same way you would have, like, say, an atomic clock on an airplane going around, and if you actually have it fly around the world, you're going to get a different time than you have the same atomic clock put in Death Valley, like right at the very bottom of it. It's going to actually be two different times. Same way you would something on a rocket. Like two different speeds would actually distort the space and time. Like if you have enough speed and amplification of mass, you're going to actually have you're going to distort that space-time. Right. So supposedly, the way he describes it too is just like whatever is moving around is just like these gravity amplification vehicles, you know what I mean? And that's the reason why when a lot of these things are described, there would be a no inertia. Essentially, if you're making a 90-degree turn and, you know what I mean, like how the hell could that thing move that fast? Everything inside would be splat up against the wall. You're actually not moving through the same way that you would actually see it. It's actually, you're bringing space-time towards you. So if you're in a distortion, you can move through space-time like that. So really interesting. Anyway, I'd recommend anyone kind of who doesn't know anything about Bob Lazar, watch his documentary. There's a lot of good stuff that you could find on that. But yeah, he was one that was, they try to discredit him, and they try to say like, oh, he didn't work at Los Alamos and doesn't have all these credentials, and then you could actually find him in the phone book. Yeah. He talks about the bone scanners before those even got released to the public, and how they actually biometrically measure your bone density, and that's how you actually got into these facilities. Those things got released, I think, like 6 or 7 years ago, where they actually found that and they vindicated that. That's in Jeremy Corbell's recent documentary too. They talk about that. But it's there's a lot of whistleblowers out there that talk about, you know, certain things working on these black budget projects and things like that. I think a lot of that is what you see today, the Tic Tac incident. Have you heard of that with Commander Fravor?
No.
So this is a very famous case that happened in 2004. The USS Nimitz is a big naval carrier for the U.S. off the coast of San Diego, about 80 miles off the coast of the shore of San Diego. They're running these routine, like, you know, drills and things like that. Commander Fravor was a Top Gun pilot, sees this, you know, they're like, oh, okay, they touch base with the U.S. Nimitz, and they say, like, yeah, there's a lot of these weird things popping up on the radar. They're like, oh, let's go investigate. Let's go see what these things are. They've been popping up forever. They're like, they're not sure what they are. They pretty much go into this this area where they see them, and they see these little, like, they describe them as like 20-foot long, white Tic Tac looking objects, and they're just like, they're zipping around with just like amazing speed. They're just like, they're not being affected by wind. They're not being affected by their own propulsion. Like, they're just literally, one moment they're zipping in and out of reality. And they see them kind of looking over this object that's actually in the water. And there's like a water break from it, and they're like this giant cross looking thing. And they're like, it almost seems like they're trying to recover something, whatever they're doing. They're trying to figure out what these things are and what they're even doing. Anyway, they try to start, Commander Fravor and there was one other plane, 3 other pilots on it that all testified to the same thing. They all get into this kind of almost like a aerial dogfight, even though they're not necessarily armed, and it was actually a routine training mission. And then they see all this stuff like go on. They're like, what are these things? You know what I mean? And they have a cap point. Essentially, I'm not a pilot or anything like that, but a cap point is something that's described as like a recall position for something where it's like, okay, your cap point's like your safety point where you could go. They try actually closing in on these things. That thing shows up within a split second. I think it was like 10 to 15 miles away, in a split second right at the cap point. So it knew exactly where their cap point was, could outmaneuver them like no problem. They captured the images on FLIR technology too. They actually have evidence of this, radar technology. They have multiple witness accounts, and all from high credential military operatives too. So it's like, that's one of the ones that is looked at today as like the most concrete evidence of like UFO encounters. You know what I mean? So
those are like the most common conspiracy theories, right? When it comes to UFOs and what we actually
It could be us. You know what I mean? Those could be drones that actually, those I think maybe, and this is hard to say, they could be alien too, but I think they originated from alien reproductive vehicles. I think that technology, maybe what Bob Lazar is on and did during the 80s, I think that maybe has finally hit some kind of black budget program and black op program where there's maybe a breakaway civilization where we actually have this technology now. And it's so secret. Because imagine having that kind of immense power where you can manipulate space-time, gravity, things like that. If you can manipulate that, you control the world. You know what I mean? It's just, there's nothing really to stop you. If you could actually run at that speed, you could let off nukes over the entire world within seconds. You know what I mean? It's just like, there's nothing. If you know where everyone is and everything is, I mean, you have almost absolute power. You know what I mean? So it's a crazy technology to even think that would exist. Would it actually be used for good of humanity? How much it could do? How much clean energy? How much, you know, you wouldn't have to fucking wait, 22 hours to travel to Japan. You could actually come. Yeah, you could. Everyone would just be there in a few seconds, be like, oh, this is great. You know what I mean? But I think it'll be a long time before humanity could ever evolve to that if we ever do. So, but I think the stuff's out there, and I think there's enough evidence too. That's just the tip of the iceberg where this stuff has existed. And it goes to a very dark place too, actually, the deeper you go into the UFO phenomenon.
Oh, I'm sure.
I think the technology now is actually, we reproduce this technology and we actually have it. But now it's so locked up, it would take an act of God. The guy who actually worked at Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, a lot of these military industry contractors, he even said it would take an act of God for some of this technology to get released to the public. So I think his name was Ben Starr or something like that. I can't remember his name, but yeah, he was a former CEO of Lockheed Martin and did Skunk Works too. So all these military contractors, there's tons of people who've come out within that division too that are whistleblowers as well too. But not to blow your mind too much.
Dude, you just like go around the bar like, hey, fun fact, I don't know if you knew this.
I don't talk to anyone about this shit. I think I maybe mentioned to Logan a couple times, and he's just like, oh God. He's
like if someone brings up a certain topic.
He's like, how does this affect my fucking VIP list for this weekend?
Yeah.
He doesn't give a shit.
Like, oh man.
Yeah, it goes deep, but I find it absolutely fascinating. I mean, if we talk about the root of what we're doing here as humans, we talk about like, meaning of life and like what all this shit really means, and why are we here? That's the biggest thing. There's no one like humans, really.
Yeah.
You talk about dolphins, maybe the next smartest thing. No one builds things like we do. No one does the crazy monkey shit that we do. We have nuclear fucking weapons that can destroy this whole damn place. We destroy our solar system if we wanted to. And what are we doing? You know what I mean? What the fuck are we doing? Yeah. That's a big question. You know what I mean? It's just like, who's really in control? Who's really pulling these strings? And that's really what gets me interested in a lot of this stuff.
Are there any, I'm sure there are, but are there any specific conspiracy theories out there about the creation of the world when it comes to like the believers who believe, God's son came down and created land and water and...
So I got to ask you to clarify that too. Would you actually, conspiracies as far as would align with the religious epitaphs of that?
Just in general.
Just in general. Yeah. So, I mean, Ancient Aliens has been up and down this thing. They call that the Anunnaki. And if you look at like ancient Zulu tribes and a lot of this stuff, like Sumerians as well, and you're talking about like some of the oldest tribes with recorded history too, they talk about this. They talk about a time before the moon existed. They talk about what the world was like before the moon. If you look at the moon, that's a whole nother fucking, that thing is right in front of your face.
That's right.
And that thing is like a conspiracy within itself. 50 years since we purportedly have a manned mission back. Does that sound a little weird to you? You know what I mean, right there. But anyway, going back to the Anunnaki, as far as seeding everything like here, they talk about a civilization that was around before the Younger Dryas period, and we're talking about 11 and a half thousand years ago. It's well beyond BC. They talk about, the beginning of man and civilization. They're talking about, 4,500 years ago, pyramids of Giza. It's a tomb for Khufu and things like that, and that's a great conspiracy too. But they talk about like the Anunnaki, like these star gods essentially seeding man, and they were actually the creator of man. And they built, just like actually they say in a lot of religious texts, they say in the Christian and Catholic texts too, they talk about they built man in the image of God. So essentially a lot of these, they're talking about what they are. They're like star seeders. They came here and they talk about like, seeding man and building us into this, manipulating our genes into becoming this intelligent beings that can walk around. So a lot of these, what I think they were, they're people that look like us. If you look at a lot of the abduction cases, and this gets really weird too, you look at like Travis Walton's testimony. He was a guy that was actually in Arizona too, 1975 loggers. All passed lie detector tests. He talks about his experience waking up in abduction. He was missing for 5 days and 6 hours. And yeah, he woke up into this state, and he saw these, you know, typical like almost gray looking aliens, you know what I mean? Fucking went crazy. He actually saw what they call as the Pleiadians. And these are these tall Nordic looking aliens, and they have, you know, blonde hair, blue eyes, extremely muscular. They're all about like 6'3", 6'4". They communicate telepathically. And this has been a common theme throughout the alien abduction scenarios too. A lot of theories go back to that the Anunnaki are these kind of people, and they built us in the image of them. You know what I mean? They seeded us essentially from other star systems. And we're nothing more than a science project, you know what I mean? We're a fucking zoo, you know what I mean, for them to kind of look at. And if you actually follow the abduction phenomenon, and a lot of testimony that would include this too, a lot of the little grays, they could actually be, they talk about this being, they're kind of like android AI, you know what I mean, controlled. They're biological entities at the same time, but they're actually servants of what the Anunnaki are, and to kind of manipulate our genes. That's why they're so interested always in our reproduction. They talk about any kind of abduction scenarios too. They're always interested in, you know, getting samples, reproduction, potentially even taking children. You know what I mean? There's some testimony out there that recalls that. It gets down a deep, deep dark circle too. And then if you want to even go crazier, you start looking at the cattle mutilation, you start looking at that phenomenon, you start looking at what David Paulides in his work as far as missing people goes in national parks, and how these people disappear off the face of the planet. And then they're actually found with remains like 2 to 3 years later, or even found later. They have no idea where they've been, you know, if they're alive, they have no idea what happened. Some of them do recall, and they recall scenarios like this. They call, there's a good documentary called Strange Harvest too that kind of goes into this. And yeah, if the more you actually kind of discover what's really going on, it almost seems like we're just being monitored.
That's
you know
right.
what I mean? It's just, so that kind of ties into like what we're created and actually what's really happening here. Like, you know what I mean? It almost seems like a monitored civilization. It goes really dark, and it's actually, you know, do you really want to think about stuff like that? But then you think about all the testimony that all these people, are all these people fucking crazy? They're all kind of having the same experience. You know what I mean? It's not like they're saying these, you know, alligators are taking them underwater and having these, they're all having these same kind of like psychosomatic dreams about, like, you know, the dream states, I guess you could call it. It's not like it only happens at night, but it happens a lot of times in rural areas too. And yeah, and it's happened to people that are all across. It's not just idiot farmers who have nothing better to do. Some of these people are teachers. Betty and Barney Hill, one of the famous abduction cases. There's an interracial couple during 1963. Amanda Hill is a famous UFC fighter. That's Barney Hill is her uncle. He talks about this too. They would want no extra attention thrown their way that they wouldn't want to bring attention their way. They talk about their experience of like driving home to their mother's house from New Hampshire, and they're being taken upon this craft, and they're just like, what happened right here? You know, what is this? They saw a human, they saw gray entities, they saw these weird looking things too, and it's just like, it's so weird. If you're able to move throughout space and time and you could just pluck these people out, experiment on them, see exactly what it is, and then put it back, who the fuck is gonna believe you? I mean, I would have trouble believing it too. Before I started even really kind of deep diving into this, it sounds fucking bananas.
Yeah.
You know, it sounds fucking crazy. And it gets kind of dark when you're actually looking at some of this stuff too. Like, what is the purpose behind it? But is it really that hard to believe? Is it really hard to believe that why we're here and everything that we're doing here, that we could just be a seeded civilization? Is it really that hard to believe? The universe is beyond what we know as being big. Everything's perfectly aligned for the Earth. The moon is 400 times to the distance of the sun, and it's 400 times, 25% bigger than as big as the Earth, and it's landlocked. You could only see one side of the moon. It's in perfect orbit. There's no other moons like that in the solar system, and it actually gives us our seasons. It gives us our atmosphere. It's essential for the Earth's survival. It almost seems like it's just, there's a lot of evidence that the moon is an artificial construct, and that's a part of why we have it back, and it's part of the monitoring process of why we're actually here as humans too. So it's a crazy thing. Apollo 12 mission, they talk about like dropping the rover on the moon, and they talk about like it leaving this very loud ringing sensation. They picked it up on a seismograph, and the ringing wouldn't stop for 45 minutes. The same way the moon would be like if it was hollow. they don't find the same kind of materials. Like every other moon that are on the other planets, they have the same similar materials that are made out of, the other planets. Our moon is just completely different. It's made out of cobalt, zinc, like these high density metals. And the more you actually look into all these craters that are on the moon, despite all these ones of different sizes, they should be different depth, but they're all the same depth. That's the craziest fucking thing. And they see this weird activity on the moon too. It's been recorded by scientists too. This would be a good visual part of the podcast too, because you pull it up and you could see there's mists sometimes that happen on the moon. It's supposed to have no atmosphere, and there's lights that happen within the craters too. There's supposedly, have you ever seen, Buzz Aldrin and the astronauts who landed on the moon. If you ever look at them when they got back from the moon landing, they have a very weird body language. You know what I mean? I'm not one of those guys who believes that we didn't land on the moon. I think we did. I think
just saw something that was.
I think the reason we haven't been back is another story. I think that's one too. And there's supposedly, secret transmissions of what they saw up there and why we haven't been back. You figure 50 years from now, everything's so much cheaper to do, easier to do, and why haven't we really been back? We studied the materials for the moon, and it's okay, this is it's like the moon up there is just it's just this perfect little thing that keeps the Earth protected. But yet the reason we haven't been back is okay, they just say, oh, it's too expensive. Oh, we lost the original tapes from the moon. We taped over it, VHS tapes. Have you heard that recently?
Right.
Yeah, it's come on, are you really buying any of this stuff too? If just look at the body language of Buzz Aldrin and John Collins and I'm blanking on the first man. Who's the first man on the moon? I was going to say Armstrong.
Yeah.
But if you look at their body language and talking about what everything happens as far as when they got back from the moon, it's just it's a very sombering everything's great. Of course they just been out of space and could have been gacked out of their mind, but they look like they saw something, you know what I mean, and they experienced something.
Yeah, what do you think specifically?
I think it's just they found that the moon was inhabited, you know what I mean, and that there were structures. They said actually in this transmission that was actually recorded, they talk about there was actually ships watching them, when they landed, you know what I mean. When they click off, they have a certain channel when they clicked off for the public when they're transmitting, and they talk about actually being monitored. That one I don't know if it's 100% true, but I just find it interesting that we have not been back. You know what I mean? And the moon within itself, that's a crazy thing.
So what do you think Apollo 13 was specifically?
I think Apollo 13, it was just reconnaissance to go back to see, if anything would kind of go. You're talking about the ship blowing up? That's the one where
do you think they didn't go back intentionally, or do you think their intent was to go back to the moon and then obviously what happened?
Oh, yeah. I think that could have been malfunction. Easy. Every time you're flowing rockets up at that high speeds, you're just
hoping
everything stays together. But here's the other thing too. And when we look at this, we look at astronauts who even said that they're on camera, they're on video, testifying that they've seen these alien vehicles and things like that. Gordon Cooper, actually before the Apollo missions, the Mercury missions, he talks about seeing these saucer-shaped vehicles land and just crazy shit, and then just talking to other people. Dr. Edgar Mitchell was another astronaut who talks about that as well too. He's another one that I can't remember if he landed on the moon or not, but they've all been in space. But if you look at the ones that actually have come out and talked about the conspiracy behind NASA and actually that there are some of these things that are floating around and seeing these, they don't really get celebrated too. I was recently at the JFK Center in near Cocoa Beach, and it was the old NASA facility too. They celebrate, the ones who were Buzz Aldrin, you know what I mean, guy who walked on the moon. But it's just Gordon Cooper was one of the first pioneers, blowing up there in these small ass rockets. He was the first person to actually sleep in space and everything like that. Just kind of he's just kind of swept to the wayside. Right, it's just oh yeah, he just went a little crazy. He's just talking a little bit nonsense, just these are astronauts. These are people that have been to space. These are people who put their reputation on the line for their whole family and themselves. And they talk about seeing these vehicles. And they talk about what's happening in space. And they talk about how it's not being talked about in the mainstream media and it's not being picked up. It's just, if that doesn't ring as fishy shit to you, you know what I mean? I mean, the more you delve into this subject, you realize there's a lot of doctors, there's a lot of PhDs, there's a lot of scientists who study this stuff. And they don't really care. They don't really care if they're getting blacklisted, laughed at, and things like that. They're highly intelligent people, and they record all this stuff. I mean, the whole, have you heard of Skinwalker Ranch?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Skinwalker, what do you know about Skinwalker Ranch?
Not much. Honestly, you're gonna have to refresh my memory.
Okay, so Skinwalker Ranch is supposedly this fucking shit show of like paranormal activity, UFOs, Bigfoot even, and it's just like
That's
all
right,
this
yeah.
weird stuff that kind of goes on in this. It was originally bought by this billionaire named Robert Bigelow during the 1990s because there was all this crazy activity and they were just trying to check to see if it's real. He spent a ton of money, put together this whole scientific team, sensors, you know, the latest state-of-the-art equipment during the 90s to try to figure out like what's going on with this place. He created a National Institute for Discovery Science. It's called NIDS team, and it's a group run by scientists too. Dr. Colm Keller, Eric Davis, a lot of these guys, they were looking at this place and trying to measure to find this phenomenon if they could actually find concrete evidence. And it's like every time that they would actually try measuring this stuff, or something would happen with the cattle mutilation too and things like that, it would just be off. Like the cameras would go out. It'd be this weird, mysterious shit. And so there would be like this intelligence behind it that was almost kind of guarding control. They didn't make fucking money off this. They lost their ass. You know what I mean? They weren't trying to sell, even though they wrote books about it too. It's not like they're trying to make millions, you know, off selling these books too. These are doctors with high credibility, and they don't talk about stuff that you would think that would talk about. You'd think they'd talk about, you know, oh, cool alien abduction and things like this. One of the doctors on there talks about like seeing this almost dinosaur-looking creature, like, you know what I mean? Like it's a weird like phenomenon that happened, like almost like a dimensional portal gets opened up or something through time. He talked about it, how he'd see this walking through like the ranch and be like, what the actual fuck is this thing? You know what I mean? It's just, their stories are incredible, but at the same time so it just wouldn't, they would come up with a better story.
Exactly.
A lot of these people, you know, if they're trying to make up a story, would come up with a better story. The story is like so fantastic. It's not fantastic enough for other people like to not believe, but it's like there is something to it. But whatever this intelligence is that's kind of manipulating our environment, it's way ahead of the game with us.
Oh,
You know what I mean?
that's the one thing that everybody can agree on too.
Yeah.
It's like they're way more intelligent, way smarter.
Yeah,
And that's what scares everybody.
Yeah, and they have the technology and the, I guess, the mental capacity to just kind of be at their beck and control. Like I gotta actually go back to, I kind of tap out after this stuff after a little while too, because you kind of go back to your day-to-day life. You're like, really, what could I do?
Yeah.
It's fascinating to study. Yeah, it's just like it's fascinating to study. The stuff that kind of like that stuff's kind of fun to me still too. That you kind of get into that, but the stuff that kind of like, you know, takes the winds out of your sails, and you talk about like, you know, Tuskegee experiment, all the crazy shit that the U.S. government, not only our government, but every single government and people in power that always done. You talk about the Federal Reserve and just how greed really runs the world. Those are the conspiracies that you could really kind of put like a frame to, and you're like, okay, this stuff really happens.
It all makes sense.
These are humans fucking over other humans, and it's the stuff that makes sense, and it's all for a power grab, money grab, greed grab. Probably one of the worst sins going, you know what I mean? But
the only thing going.
yeah,
Honestly.
for real. But yeah, you try to actually, it's a fun thing too. A lot of people are in the UFO stuff because it's kind of fun. You know what I mean? It's just trying to discover out more, and then you could kind of make connections to where everything, you know, may go, but you really don't know because the waters are so mucked up by so many intelligence agencies, like you don't really know what's going on. So, but yeah, it's the fun ones, like you know, we could go on and on. You know, I don't know how I remember this shit, but apparently.
How many hours worth is this?
This is like, I mean, I've been kind of looking through this stuff I'd probably say I really kind of got into it the last maybe 10 years. You know what I mean? I probably even maybe 6.
You broke open the file drawer, just.
I was always interested. Bob Lazar was one of those guys I remember seeing as a kid. I always thought it was bullshit. I was like, man, you know, this always happens to a bunch of rednecks, you know what I mean, out there, and like, ooh, guess what I saw? Like, you know what I mean? It's just like, but I remember seeing Bob Lazar as a kid, and he was the guy that I talked to, that physicist that talked about it, and the way he was explaining things, he's either one of the best liars that you ever seen, or he believes what he's saying. That I could, and even body language experts, everyone's kind of tried to pick this guy apart. At the very least, he's so convinced that whatever happened to him happened, like he believes it in his own mind, or he's telling the truth. And remember all these stories, all these astronauts that I just told you, every Commander Fravor, all this shit, how many of them does it take for it to be true? One. That's it. That's all you got. One of them's telling the truth. You have yourself a fucking mystery that is probably one of the greatest human discoveries that's going on today. Really. Like you talk about, you know, a lot of this, when it comes to the alien and UFO thing at least, if you talk about like one of those phenomenons that happen and they document it and it's real shit, that's all it is. One of those weird videos out there, if one of the, and I think 99% of them are just dog shit.
Yeah.
You know what I
Oh,
mean?
of course.
Yeah, they're just terrible.
Like, look at like all the Bigfoot videos.
Yeah.
Of people discovering Bigfoot. It's like that doesn't even look close to being
No,
real.
and there's so many fakes too. You know, and that was one of those ones too. Bigfoot's an interesting one. Like
that one's just fascinating because it's
Yeah.
like you really think that there's like a creature out there.
Yeah.
It's just like a behemoth.
this 8 foot to 10 foot
Yeah.
tall thing walking around. It smells like a dirty garbage,
Yeah.
you know, fucking pail, and it just like it has these glowing red eyes. It has no neck, and then you actually, that was funny. I went into a deep dive with this one too. I used to think that was complete bullshit too. That one I don't know about anymore because I actually listened to researchers like David Paulides and things like that. I think again that's one of those things where 99% of it is bullshit, and but if you actually realize, like if you look at like the sounds of like Bluff Creek, if you look at the Patterson Gimlin film, and you actually ask, like they went around and asked, you know, Disney producers during the 1970s if they could recreate that, and you could actually see tendons in the muscle. It looks like a guy in a suit walking around. That's what I always thought, and I'm like, some people swear by it, man. I'm still like on the fence of that. A lot of I read some of his books too to try to convince, and it kind of opened my mind a little bit more. They talk about these wild men that walk around during and giants. They talk about them during the 1980s, and he has this laundry, or not the 1800s and like the up to the 1980s, and they have this laundry list of newspaper clippings about like, you know, all these encounters with these supposed wild men, and they say it's more closer to human than it is animal. The only problem I have with, like, you know, the giant they call it giant panthecus or whatever like that. It's like this whole thing. They never found any fossil records of those in North America, but they have found fossil records of giants. Could have been of like something where, you know, it's an extinct race that could have, you know, maybe died out closer to the 1800s, 1900s before they could get good documented evidence on it. It's possible. That I could believe. Or could it be an interdimensional creature, which some people really believe, where it kind of comes in and out of reality. It doesn't speak to this. They're supposedly able to communicate telepathically. I mean, if you look at some of those interviews and credible things too, it's just like, I don't know, man. That one I still very much on the fence about, you know what I mean? You like to, that's a fun one to kind of go down though too. David Paulides he's the missing 411 guy. He just started investigating missing people in national parks. Yeah. And he kind of got into that stuff. Former police officer, really good detective work. He has a recent documentary out called Missing 411, The UFO Connection. Brilliant documentary actually. And that one, you know, it doesn't talk anything necessarily about Bigfoot, but he's a Bigfoot believer. And he talks about all these disappearances, and he talks about some of the cases in which involves Bigfoot, and you're like, okay, I guess so, Dave, you know what I mean? But he actually uses evidence when it comes to like his cases, you know what I mean? What can you find? They're missing shoes, they've been gone for this 3 days, they have no recollection of what happens, or they're missing for several years. 100 sniffer dogs, you know, try to get a scent, they're on the case, sniffer dogs can't get a scent, you know what I mean? But yet their remains are found in areas that they just look 3 or 4 months later, and the body's just dumped in a river or something like that. But their shoes are in mint condition, but yet they've been out there that long. Or their shoes and socks, their clothes are removed, and you're like, what the fuck is going on? Yeah. Interesting stuff. But yeah, the Bigfoot's kind of a fun one. I still don't know if I buy that one too.
Yeah,
you know?
that one's like the most generic conspiracy theory that you could think of, right?
It's a goofy one. It's a cryptid one too. I mean, you go down like the cryptid rabbit hole. You got like Mothman. I mean, shit. You talk about, I guess, lizard people would be like.
Oh yeah.
The whole lizard controlling, and that kind of ties in with the adrenochrome thing too. If we're being orchestrated by, you know, a different reptilian base, that one is so tough for me to kind of swallow, because you have no hope for anything.
No, you'd have to see that one to believe it, and then when you do believe it, you're like, shit.
Shape-shifting reptilians, that's fucking nuts.
Yeah.
And it's like, if that one's true, there's zero hope for anything. I could buy the fact that we're controlled by a higher intelligence that kind of seeded us here in the earth. But I could, you know,
it makes more sense.
It makes more sense. It's just like, where do we come from? How did we get here? Did we have a creator? It kind of ties in with a lot of the biblical stuff too. It doesn't necessarily mean that anything of that stuff's true. Those could be rules to live by. Treat others with how you'd want to be treated. Treat people good. Don't lie. Don't steal. don't fuck up, you know what I mean, essentially. Paraphrasing the 10 Commandments, but, if all that stuff is to kind of be, true, and this is how we got left, okay, that kind of makes sense, you know what I mean? If we're being monitored, manipulated, that kind of you kind of grasp that. But when it comes to lizard people just eating baby blood and people
that's where it's far right.
Yeah.
Just, I don't know, man.
Yeah, you're going off a cliff there. And I'm not saying, I'm open-minded enough to entertain anything, because I'll research it. I think it's fucking super interesting.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
It's all right, I'll do my research. Maybe that one fact makes sense.
Yeah.
But
and none of this
I'm not going to go out of my way to tell people, Tom Hanks is eating babies.
Yeah. That's a tough one, man.
You're all idiots. He's eating babies.
Yeah, that's a tough one to be a part of anything too. I mean, do I believe a secret societies exist? Oh, there's absolute proof of that. Yeah. You know what I mean? There's absolute proof that secret societies and secret moves always get. I mean, Epstein client list still hasn't got released. But do you believe it's controlled by these, lizard reptilian folk that are trying to get everyone under their demonic control? I don't know. I don't know about that one. But all of this stuff, how does this pertain to our everyday lives? It really doesn't. You know what I mean? We're gonna get on with our lives. Yeah, we're gonna get on with our lives and just live our fucking happy selves. We're gonna talk about it's it's kind of a cool talking point, because it kind of piques your interest. You're like, oh yeah, this is kind of cool. But once you start going down that rabbit hole, it almost kind of becomes less fun.
Yeah.
It kind of gets really deep, and it could kind of get dark, and you're like, but there's some truth to it. That's a fucked up thing. There's some truth to the UFO phenomenon. There's enough evidence out there where this shit is really happening. There's enough evidence where, JFK was assassinated, and he was killed by, CIA operatives. But, how far do you want to go down that rabbit hole? You know what I mean? It's just I believe some fucked up shit's happening. You know what I mean? But.
Well, I hope we disrupted your minds for at least this past hour, because that's literally what it is. It's oh, this is what the world is.
Yep.
It's there is truth behind this.
There is a little bit of stuff that you could, and a lot of it could be fun too. You know what I mean? It's just
I'm
There's
not happy conspiracy theories out there.
Yes, and I'm not I think the biggest researchers in conspiracy theories that you follow are the ones who truly say, I don't know. You know what I mean? Because no one really does when you get a lot of this stuff. You could say things, you could point to the evidence. I gave a lot of names, I gave a lot of things that happened, I gave information about sworn affidavits, stuff you could look up and find for yourself too. These are astronauts, military personnel too. You could go up and look up for yourself. This is not stuff that necessarily is a conspiracy. These are people that are talking. If they're conspiring in their own way, that's different. But it's stuff that you could fact check kind of for yourself too.
Oh yeah. So it's all interesting stuff.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to do hours and hours and hours about different conspiracy.
Yeah, literally.
Next time I'm bringing my list. I'm printing out my papers.
I didn't even touch the pyramids either, honestly.
No,
I didn't even.
We'll have to save that for next time.
Right.
Where can the people follow you on social media?
Spruce Goose on Instagram, and then
that's good.
Yeah,
Spruce
Goose. My last name's Goossen, so I always kind of work that way. I don't really have a YouTube channel or anything like that. If you ever want to come to the bar and harass me, I'm always here at the Hot Chick.
Now you know.
I mean? Yeah. If you really want to talk deep stuff like that, oh God, please send me an email. If you want to talk a little bit about it, it's cool. I don't really talk about this stuff really. This is not something I bring up at parties or anything like that.
No, he'll make you think.
Yeah.
Come approach him at the bar.
If you start talking this stuff about me, you just open up a fucking floodgate, because I'll just kind of yeah.
Oh, you have a media company too, huh?
Oh yeah, Bitesized Brands as well. Me and my wife run that. It's basically we do social media, graphic design work. We do it for a lot of the bars around. We do it for here at the Hot Chick. How about with Boondocks, 50 Shades of Rose, Becky, Seltzer, Almost Famous. You know what I mean? So yeah, the media company is kind of I kind of do the website portion of it and the tech aspect of it. My wife handles pretty much most of it now, because it's I'm busy with this place.
Of course.
I could Photoshop goofy shit into funny areas. I still kind of do that here and there, but that's it.
Start your own conspiracy theories with Photoshop.
Oh yeah.
And AI, huh?
Oh yeah, AI generated stuff.
Didn't even
super
grasp
cool.
AI.
Yeah, that's a whole nother one too.
Yeah,
Maybe another time.
We'll save that one for next time. But this was episode 704 of the podcast, guys. Remember to comment, like, and subscribe on our YouTube channel at Jack O'Hara TV.